Mr. Eastwood, he began, this is the second time I remind you that religious symbols are not allowed in this courtroom. Remove your cross or leave the premises. A hush fell over the courtroom. All eyes turned to Clint. His weathered face remained calm, but a spark lit up in his eyes. He didn't rush to respond. Instead, he slowly placed a hand over the cross, as if protecting it. Journalists in the back rows were already feverishly taking notes, sensing a headline in the making. For the older generation who followed the news, this wasn't just a dispute. It was a challenge to a system they saw as increasingly limiting personal freedom. With all due respect, Your Honor, Clint began, his voice low and deliberate like an old sheriff in a western. This cross belonged to my mother. She gave it to me before she died, and I've worn it for 70 years. It's not a symbol of protest, it's a memory. If you think it violates the rules, please explain exactly which rule I'm breaking. Judge Collins frowned. He wasn't used to having his decisions questioned, especially not so calmly. A quiet murmur swept through the room. A few elderly women in the front row exchanged glances. They remembered a time when faith was a part of life, not a cause for conflict. Mr. Eastwood, the judge, replied sharply, "This is not the place for personal stories. The court's rules are clear, no religious symbols. Either comply or I will have you removed." Clint tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the judge's words. Then he slowly stood. His movements were unhurried but confident, like a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Tension filled the room. Everyone expected him to either remove the cross or make a scene. But Clint did something unexpected. "Your Honor," he said, "I am not here as a defendant, but as a witness in a case about justice. Want to expel me over this cross? Perhaps we should first discuss why I'm here. Because unless I'm mistaken, this case is about discrimination, isn't it?" Judge Collins blinked. The case in question had made headlines. A young teacher, Anna Martinez, had sued the school district that fired her for refusing to remove a religious symbol from her classroom. Clint Eastwood had been called as a witness because he had funded the charity supporting Anna. But no one expected him to become part of the controversy himself. "Mr. Eastwood," the judge raised his voice, "stay on topic. Remove the cross, and we'll proceed." Clint smiled, just barely, but it was a smile full of quiet resolve. He turned to Anna's attorney, a young man named Thomas Reed, who was nervously flipping through his papers. "Thomas," Clint said, "remind me of the article in the Constitution that guarantees freedom of religion." Thomas, startled, quickly replied, "The First Amendment, Mr. Eastwood. It prohibits the government from restricting religious freedom." "Thank you," Clint nodded, then turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer, but I know the First Amendment protects my right to wear this cross. If you want me out, you'll need to explain how that doesn't violate the Constitution." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Elderly spectators, who'd grown up during the civil rights era, felt their hearts beat faster. To them, Clint wasn't just a celebrity. He was a symbol of old America, where principles mattered. Reporters scrambled to type out headlines. "Clint Eastwood challenges judge over cross." Judge Collins flushed. He clearly hadn't anticipated this turn of events. His aide, a young man in a sharp suit, leaned over and whispered something to him. The judge frowned even deeper, but finally leaned back in his chair. "Very well, Mr. Eastwood," he said. "You may remain, but don't think that gives you the right to disrupt my court." Clint nodded, but his eyes stayed fixed on the judge. He sat down, but the tension in the room didn't fade. Everyone could feel it. This was only the beginning. While the judge called the next witness, Clint quietly watched Anna Martinez. She looked to be in her early 30s, but stress had aged her. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the papers on her desk. Clint knew her story. She had taught history in a middle school, but lost her job over a small cross hanging in her classroom. The school board claimed it violated their neutrality policy, though Anna had never imposed her beliefs on anyone. To Clint, this wasn't just a case, it was a fight for the principles he believed in. When Anna was called to the stand, the courtroom fell silent. Her voice was quiet but firm. "I never meant to offend anyone," she said. "This cross was a gift from my grandmother. It reminded me why I became a teacher, to teach kindness and respect." Elizabeth Wilson, the school district's lawyer, smiled coldly. "Ms. Martinez, don't you think your cross could have made students uncomfortable if they didn't share your beliefs?" Anna shook her head. "I never talked about religion in class. My students knew I respected all of them, no matter what they believed." Clint listened, his fists clenched. He saw Elizabeth trying to trap Anna with her sincerity, but he also knew Anna wouldn't back down. And he was here to support her. After recess, it was Clint's turn to testify. He stood, feeling dozens of eyes on him. The smell of coffee mixed with the faint scent of dust settling on old benches. Outside, the city buzzed, car horns, distant sirens. But inside, there was silence. "Mr. Eastwood," Elizabeth Wilson began, "you fund the foundation supporting Ms. Martinez. Why is this case important to you?" Clint cleared his throat. His voice, though a bit raspy with age, carried strength. "I grew up in a country where people could be themselves without fear of punishment for their beliefs. Anna Martinez didn't preach in class. She just wore a cross, like I do. If that's enough to fire someone, then we've lost something important." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "But don't you think religious symbols in schools could make students uncomfortable?" Clint leaned forward. "Uncomfortable? Life isn't about avoiding discomfort. It's about teaching kids to respect others, even when they disagree. That's exactly what Anna was doing. And the school board punished her for being who she is." Clint sat in his seat, his silver cross once again drawing attention, gleaming against the backdrop of his old-fashioned gray suit. His face was calm, but his eyes carefully tracked every movement in the courtroom. Anna Martinez, sitting next to her lawyer, Thomas Reed, nervously fiddled with the edge of her dress. Judge Edward Collins entered the room, his robe rustling, and his gaze was even sterner than the day before. He clearly hadn't forgotten Clint's challenge and seemed determined to regain control. "We will continue the hearing in the case of Martinez versus the school district," the judge announced, striking the gavel. "Mr. Reed, call your next witness." Thomas stood, his voice confident but with a hint of nervousness. "We call Mr. Clint Eastwood to continue his testimony." Clint slowly rose, feeling dozens of eyes on him. His steps were measured but firm, his gait reminiscent of the hero in his old westerns, someone unafraid to stand their ground. He took his place at the witness stand, resting his hands on the rail. The room fell silent, waiting for him to speak. Elizabeth Wilson, the school district's lawyer, stood from her seat. Her movements were sharp, and her smile was cold, like steel. She had clearly prepared for this moment, considering Clint an easy target due to his age and lack of legal experience. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, "yesterday you spoke about the First Amendment and freedom of religion. But don't you think that in a public school, where children with various beliefs are educated, religious symbols could create an atmosphere of exclusion?" Clint looked at her, his eyes narrowing, but his voice remained calm. "Ms. Wilson, I'm not a lawyer, but I know what respect is. Anna Martinez didn't preach in class. She wore a cross, just like I wear mine. If that offends someone, the problem isn't with the cross. It's with how we teach people to respond to differences." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, clearly preparing her next move. "Funny that you mention respect, Mr. Eastwood. But do you respect the rules of this court? Yesterday, you refused to remove your cross despite the judge's direct order. Don't you think that shows a lack of respect for the law?" A low murmur spread through the room. Elderly spectators, who had grown up in an era where principles were valued above formalities, leaned forward, awaiting his response. Judge Collins furrowed his brow, his fingers tightening around the gavel. Clint smiled, just barely, but it was a smile full of confidence. "Ms. Wilson, I respect the law. But I also respect the Constitution, which stands above any court rules. If you want to talk about disrespect, let's talk about why Anna Martinez was fired for being herself. That's not respect, that's discrimination. The room erupted in whispers. Journalists scrambled to take notes, and a few elderly women in the front row nodded approvingly. Anna, sitting at her desk, looked up at Clint, and a look of gratitude flashed in her eyes. Elizabeth, not losing composure, took a step forward. Mr. Eastwood, you're known for your career in Hollywood, but this is not a movie set. You can't just quote the Constitution and expect that to convince the court. Do you have specific evidence that Ms. Martinez's firing was illegal? Clint leaned forward, his voice dropping but becoming more piercing. Evidence? I saw this young woman lose her job because she refused to hide who she was. I saw how the school board ignored complaints from her students, who said she was the best teacher. And I see how you're trying to distract from the real issue, Ms. Wilson. If you want evidence, I can provide documents from my foundation that show a pattern of teacher rights violations in this district. A dead silence fell over the room. Even Judge Collins, who had seemed unshakable until then, raised his eyebrows in surprise. Elizabeth Wilson blinked rapidly, clearly not expecting this turn of events. Thomas Reed, Anna's lawyer, quickly flipped through his papers, trying to understand what Clint was referring to. What documents? Elizabeth asked sharply, her voice betraying a hint of panic. Clint turned to the judge, his gaze as firm as granite. Your Honor, my foundation has been gathering data on discrimination cases in California schools for 3 years. We have letters from teachers, termination reports, even internal memos from the school board showing they intentionally violated the First Amendment. I'm prepared to submit these documents to the court, if you allow it. The room exploded. Journalists rushed to write, spectators whispered, and the elderly people in the front row exchanged excited looks. For them, who remembered the civil rights movements of the 60s, this was a moment when one man was challenging the system, and doing so with dignity. Judge Collins slammed the gavel, trying to restore order. Silence in the courtroom, he barked. Then he turned to Clint. Mr. Eastwood, this is a serious accusation. Do you understand that these documents will need to be verified for authenticity? Clint nodded. I understand, Your Honor, and I'm ready to provide everything that's necessary. But let me ask, why are we arguing about my cross when the real issue is how the system punishes people for their beliefs? The judge fell silent. His face was unreadable, but a shadow of doubt flickered in his eyes. Elizabeth Wilson, sensing she was losing control, tried to steer the conversation elsewhere. Your Honor, this is a distraction. Mr. Eastwood is not a lawyer, and his so-called documents have nothing to do with this case. But Clint didn't let her finish. He turned to the room, his voice growing louder, but still maintaining that calm strength. This isn't about me, Ms. Wilson. It's about Anna, about her students, about everyone who's forced to stay silent because someone decided their faith is a problem. If you want to talk about the law, let's talk about justice. The room erupted in applause. The elderly spectators, who saw in Clint a symbol of old America, where principles mattered more than bureaucracy, couldn't contain themselves. Judge Collins slammed the gavel again, but even he couldn't hide that Clint's words had struck a chord. Anna Martinez, sitting at her desk, closed her eyes, her lips trembling. She knew that this moment could change everything, not just for her, but for everyone who had faced such injustice. Judge Collins raised his hand, halting the murmurs. I'm calling a recess, he said. Mr. Eastwood, your documents will be reviewed. But I warn you, if this is a bluff, you will face the consequences. Clint simply nodded, his eyes never leaving the judge. He knew this wasn't a bluff, and he knew the fight had only just begun. As the room began to empty, Clint turned to Anna. Her eyes were shining with tears, but she smiled. How do you do it? She quietly asked. Aren't you scared? Clint shrugged, his voice barely a whisper. Fear is normal, Anna. But staying silent when you see injustice, that's not for me. Mr. Eastwood, the judge began, you have claimed to have documents that allegedly prove systematic discrimination within the school district. The court has received these materials. But I warn you, if they do not support your claims, there will be serious consequences. Clint stood at the witness stand, his posture straight and his gaze unwavering. His silver cross, now a symbol of this battle, glinted quietly on his chest. He nodded, not taking his eyes off the judge. I understand, Your Honor, but the truth is, these documents speak for themselves. Thomas Reed rose, holding a folder of papers. His voice trembled with excitement, but he tried to maintain his confidence. Your Honor, allow me to present evidence provided by Mr. Eastwood's foundation. This includes internal memos from the school board confirming that Ms. Martinez's dismissal was part of a broader policy aimed at removing any religious expressions, even when they did not violate the law. We also have testimonies from other teachers who have faced similar pressure. Elizabeth Wilson, the school district's attorney, sharply rose to her feet. Objection, she exclaimed. These documents were not properly disclosed in advance. This is a procedural violation. Judge Collins raised his hand, halting her. I will review these documents, Ms. Wilson. But if they are authentic, this could change the course of the case. Proceed, Mr. Reed. Thomas began reading excerpts from the memos. A dead silence fell over the courtroom. The documents revealed that the school board had deliberately ignored the First Amendment, instructing school principals to dismiss teachers for any religious symbols, even if they did not interfere with the educational process. One of the memos directly referred to Anna Martinez as a problem that needs to be addressed. The elderly audience in the courtroom exchanged glances. For them, who had grown up during the civil rights struggle, this was not just a legal issue, it was a fight for freedom. Journalists were feverishly taking notes, anticipating headlines. Clint Eastwood exposes corruption in schools. Feeling she was losing ground, Elizabeth Wilson made a desperate attempt to regain control. Your Honor, she said, even if these documents are authentic, Mr. Eastwood lacks the legal qualifications to interpret them. He is an actor, not a lawyer. His presence here is just a stunt to attract the press. A murmur ran through the courtroom. But Clint, instead of getting angry, smiled, that barely noticeable smile that once made his Western heroes so dangerous. Ms. Wilson, he said, his voice low and penetrating, I am not a lawyer. But I know what justice is. And I know that when a system punishes people for who they are, someone has to say enough. You can call it a stunt, but I call it the truth. The courtroom erupted in applause. The elderly spectators couldn't contain themselves. They saw in Clint not just a celebrity, but a man who stood by his principles. Even Judge Collins, though he banged his gavel, couldn't hide that Clint's words had struck him. But then came a turn no one expected. Judge Collins raised his hand, silencing the murmur. Enough, he said. His voice was quiet but heavy, like stone. Mr. Eastwood, I acknowledge that your documents hold weight. But I must also acknowledge something else. Everyone froze. Anna squeezed Thomas's hand, her eyes wide. Clint tilted his head, waiting. I was wrong, the judge continued. Yesterday, I demanded that you remove your cross, thinking it was necessary for order. But after listening to you and reviewing these documents, I realized that order is not always justice. I apologize, Mr. Eastwood. The courtroom gasped. Journalists rushed to take notes, and the elderly spectators, who rarely saw a judge admit his mistake, sat in shock. Clint simply nodded, his eyes warm but firm. Thank you, Your Honor, he said quietly. But this is not about me. This is about Anna. The judge turned to Anna, who was sitting, holding her breath. Ms. Martinez, he said, based on this evidence, I rule that your dismissal was unlawful. The case will be forwarded for further consideration, but I recommend that the school district reinstate you and provide compensation. Anna covered her face with her hands, her shoulders trembling with tears. Thomas hugged her, and the courtroom erupted in applause again. The elderly spectators, who saw this victory as echoing their own struggles, smiled, wiping away tears. But Clint didn't rush to celebrate. He walked out of the courtroom, ignoring the flashes of cameras and the questions from journalists. On the courthouse steps, Anna caught up with him. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice trembling, "I don't know how to thank you. You've changed my life." Clint stopped, looking at the city below. The wind carried the scent of the ocean, and the distant honks of cars reminded him of the relentless rhythm of San Francisco. "This is not the end, Anna," he said. "It's just the beginning. The system won't change in a day, but every step counts."